Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual practices. In this episode, we'll talk with Victoria Loorz, co-founder of the Wild Church Network, a broad association of religious communities that practice faith life in ways that foster connectedness to all of creation. Victoria also helped to start the Seminary of the Wild, an experiential education and formation program for spiritual leaders seeking to pioneer new, earth-centered faith practices. In our conversation, we'll ask her about her forthcoming book, Church of the Wild, How Nature Invites Us into the Sacred. She invites us into the conversation with a passage read from her book.
Those who identify as spiritual but not religious have told me that nature is already their church. They've said, if this wild church had been an option for me, maybe I would not have left a religion. And I understand and relate. Many have been wounded and disappointed and betrayed by the institutional church, or by the people who misuse the power that the institution of church gives them. Nature, powerful though she is, doesn't abuse her power. Replacing our spirituality back into the actual sacred world where it has been rooted for most of history is a way to restore our place in a more primal power embedded in systems of earth.
Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. Victoria, welcome back to the podcast.
Yay, thank you.
So we probably need to reintroduce you to our listeners. So maybe you could tell us what it is you're invested in these days and what you do day to day.
Well, my heart is invested in helping people reconnect with what Thomas Berry calls the great conversation, which includes our conversation within ourselves, between one another, and between us and the rest of the natural world. And so it's really an integration of our spirituality and the rest of the natural world, a reintegration, because I believe that it's something that's been, is at the foundation of the Christian tradition as well as most other religious traditions. So in doing that, most of my day is spent with Seminary of the Wild. We connect people from all over North America. We have some people in Europe too who join our Seminary of the Wild year-long programs. And then also work with other churches who have started churches of the wild, with different names, but churches that meet outside of buildings in the natural world.
So the impetus of our conversation is a book that you've written that's coming out soon. I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind to start us off reading a passage from that book to maybe give us a sense of what it's about and give us a place to start our conversation with.
My book comes out in a couple months. It's called Church of the Wild, How Nature Invites Us into the Sacred. And this is pretty much the ending of the first chapter. Those who identify as spiritual but not religious have told me that nature is already their church. They've said, if this wild church had been an option for me, maybe I would not have left a religion. And I understand and relate. Many have been wounded and disappointed and betrayed by the institutional church, or by the people who misuse the power that the institution of church gives them. Nature, powerful though she is, doesn't abuse her power. Replacing our spirituality back into the actual sacred world where it has been rooted for most of history is a way to restore our place in a more primal power embedded in systems of earth. Wild Church replaces a human, quote, kindom paradigm of hierarchy and monarchy and inequality with the power systems of earth, which can be described as a, quote, kindom without the G. A kindom of cooperation and kindred reciprocity. Church of the Wild is one way to help us live into a new story of a kingdom of God that includes the whole system of life and regards all humans and all species as inherently good and valuable. In this kingdom, we love neighbors, all neighbors, as ourselves. We do unto others, all others, as we would have them do unto us. Can a world, though, be saved by love alone? It sounds nice, like a meme with a sunset in the background. Some may want to call this a spiritual bypass. And in our current state of crisis, the need for immediate and active resolution is real. Against what odds in these coming days of unraveling can love prevail? How can a civilization based on domination and control and selfishness and all other disturbing things wrong with our society change into literally its opposite before we succeed in destroying the entire planet? It's implausible, and yet the preposterous transformative power of love at the core of nearly every religion, including my own, may just be the only way through.
So there's a lot to unpack there, but let me ask you first, why did you write the book? Why this book at this time?
Well, this is the core of my work, and it's sort of my journey from experiencing the sacred in nature when I was young, even though I didn't have those kinds of words for it, and then coming into the church in my 20s and finding words for this sacred presence that I had experienced and finding a community. But unfortunately, when I found that community, it was in a pretty conservative church. God was not to be found in nature. That was called, there were names for that. And so I just kind of kept it separate. And then later, after becoming a pastor, I still couldn't quite integrate spirituality with nature. It was still something really, really separate. It was only after I left being a pastor and I left actually even going to church and being part of a Christian community for about 7 years. But during that time, I started a nonprofit with my son called Kids versus Global Warming, because he felt driven to do something about the global climate crisis. And even that kind of left us both in burnout after pushing so hard to make change at something that is just so much bigger than any one kid or any one organization or any one generation even can make the differences that need to happen in our current world. We had lost connection with, like, intimate connection with the actual beings and places of the natural world. And so that started my journey in this. And it became clear that this isn't just a idiosyncratic thing that I'm doing on the side for people that love the outdoors. It's really something that Spirit's calling into being. And I felt called to it.
So this book is definitely your story. It's also the story of a movement, the Wild Church movement. But I will say that it's so much more than that. Because even though those are the foundations, or maybe we'll call it the framework, there's really big ideas, transformative ideas in this book that I do think people are hungry to hear, because you really are recommending a reorientation of people's faith practice, of people's spirituality. So we'll talk about all that in a bit, but I wonder if you could tell us a story that will help us to understand your relationship to nature. Maybe a moment that formed you, or a moment that you realized something new about your calling and vocation when it comes to nature.
I grew up not in deep connection with wilderness. We never went camping. It wasn't my mom's thing. It wasn't anything my dad did. We moved a lot, and we lived in suburbs. But every place I moved, I'd always find a little place that I could call my own. You know, it might be on the corner of a construction site where a new house was being built, or the little river that I would call a river going down the sidewalk from people watering their lawns. But I always had a little place that was my own, that was connected with wildness. And wildness can be the little weeds growing through the cracks, or the stars, or the clouds. But it wasn't until 7 or 8 years ago, we were out in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. And we would go on these 1 to 2 hour long, what we call wandering. So you're wandering in nature and sort of waiting to see where you feel drawn. And there might be an invitation to pay attention to something in particular. But in reality, like whatever happens, happens. Because I do believe that Christ is in all things. And therefore, Christ is in all things. And when that is true, even though I get surprised when these things happen, when you are open, what you pay attention to pays attention to you, kind of thing. So I was very attentive and wandering with reverence and with an openness to whatever's going to happen. And I ended up a deer, mule deer, jumped over the trail that I was on and went up a little ravine. And I just immediately knew I'm just going to follow this deer wherever it goes. And I scramble up this ravine and get to the top there. And this deer is like 15 feet in front of me, just standing there kind of waiting for me. And anyone who's seen a deer, they do this thing where you just like stare at each other. And I could see her eyes as we're staring at each other. You know, they move pretty quickly from, are you a predator? To, okay, you're safe. And so within, even 5 minutes, she sort of twitched her ears and just started eating the foliage near there. And I felt excited to be that close to a deer without her running away from me. And so I kind of settled in. It started to rain a bit and pulled a little bit closer to her to be under a tree. And within 15, 20 minutes, she looked me straight in the eyes. And she buckled her front legs and then buckled her back legs and she laid down. I had never experienced something like that level of trust, and stood there with her for a while. And when I it started to rain a little bit more, maybe I was there about another half an hour, and started to cry, just like the gift of her trusting me and her presence. And as I walked away, I said goodbye and she didn't get up. I left, went up but as I walked away, I felt that voice that I call, God's voice within me. And it said, I am with you always. And I recognize that voice as the voice of God. I recognize that voice as the voice of my own soul. But that voice, I started to wonder, that voice seemed like it also came from the deer, which made no sense to me. Kind of went, wow, that was an amazing, cool experience. Shared it with the others that I was with. And longer story short, the next day with a different deer, almost the exact same thing happened. And the third day, almost the exact same thing happened with another deer. And so it was kind of like, in case you didn't catch this is not usual. It was just this very numinous encounter. It was, when you have one of those it was really a mystical experience of connection. And it was really an invitation into drawing into what just happened here. And then when I moved up here to Bellingham, to Pacific Northwest, moved into my house, and my friends left, and I just had to return the truck, grab my keys, run out the front door, down the steps, and almost tripped over a deer that was lying down at the bottom of my steps. And since then, there's been a real relationship grown with the deer that live in this neighborhood. And I know the mama, I know all of the fawns, and the mom leaves the fawns here. She was just here with the babies. They just lay down right outside of my window now. And so we've developed a relationship of trust. And I've just learned so much about, not just about deer, but about me and about this sacred relationship and the presence of God in all things.
For some reason, you're making me think about my own deer stories. And I'll just tell it briefly that I went to school in Chicago. Chicago was a shock to me. I'd never been east of the Rockies. And so I didn't understand that places could be flat, completely flat, with no elevations, no mountains. So I kind of spent 4 years of undergraduate school in Chicago waiting to go home. So I went home after I graduated and lasted about 9 months back home before I realized that, oh no, you're not finished. There's a lot to do back in Chicago, a lot of learning, some leading. And so made the decision kind of against my will. I mean, I wasn't comfortable with the decision, but to go back to Chicago. So I drove back in my truck. And when I went to the national park at the Continental Divide, I decided to take the day slowly. So did some hiking and uh, just really sensed God's presence everywhere. In the beavers that were swimming around in the pond while I was there, I was shocked that they were doing that. They could see me, but they kept on swimming about. Got back in the car, and a storm came, just violent thunderstorm, loud and rainy. I could hardly see the road. After about 20 minutes of that, just suddenly, as I'm driving up the pass, it starts to snow. And this is August, mind you, but it starts to snow, and all the thunder was gone. It was just silent, just no sound, just snow and whiteness all around. And God was in both of those things. God was in the storm, and God was in the silence. So I got to the top of the pass, started to go over the top of the pass, and a deer stepped out in the road. So I had to stop. And as you put it, I mean, who knows what the relationship between hearing God and God's creatures is really, but as I saw the deer, I heard a clear voice. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay, and I'll be with you. And at that moment, the storm was really had cleared out on the other side of the pass. So there was a rainbow. I know it sounds corny, but it was there, stretching out down the mountain. And, before me stretched the endless flat Midwest, which is what I was terrified of. But that deer was somehow the instrument of God's voice to me, telling me that it was going to be all right, that God would be with me. I hear you.
Yes. And I think a lot of people have these experiences. We just don't really know in our culture or in our religion how to value them or take them seriously. If you don't mind, I'd like to read a little snippet of Howard Thurman's story, because he was somebody who, if you don't know who he is, he's a theologian and a mystic, really, who was called the patron saint of the civil rights movement. And he had this language of connectedness that few people have in our culture. And he talked about his connection with the sacredness of earth. And this is the little quote that your story reminded me of. He says, "There were times when it seems as if the earth and the river and the sky and I were one beat of the same pulse. It was a time of watching and waiting for what I did not know, yet I always knew. There would come a moment when beyond the single pulse beat, there was a sense of presence, which seemed always to speak to me. My response to the sense of presence always had a quality of personal communion. There was no voice, there was no image, there was no vision, there was God." He saw that trinity of like himself, the particular others of the natural world, and God as just like a communion.
And really, people who write of those experiences, unfortunately, are writing against resistance because, as you put it, there are many people who actually experience God's presence more in nature and more in creation than they might in a church. And yet the church, at least in the States, probably the Western church as a whole, doesn't make room for those experiences, right? There's a primacy placed on Scripture, on the Word of God as revelation. But we really don't get taught what to do with the God that we see in nature all around us. That experience is not something we get guidance in.
And yet, for most of history, even within the Christian religion, nature was known as the second book of Revelation, and it was known as the first book of Revelation before there were books. And so for most of the Christian story, a deep connection with the natural world is there. And that for me was really important. I needed to understand once I was having these experiences, I needed to know for myself, is this really outside of my religious tradition? Does this mean I need to leave Christianity altogether? And if it did, then I was going to have to trust my own inner authority above everything else I had been taught. But if it didn't, then it might be something that I could embrace again. That's exactly what happened. I had a series of really profound, like, aha experiences, to the point now where I have like different lens, and I read these ancient stories, these scriptures of ours, with a completely different perspective, and I can see that there's like this thread through both testaments of deep connection with the natural world. In fact, the subtitle of my book is How Nature Invites Us into the Sacred. The opposite can also be said, that the sacred invites us into the wild, that God again and again invites, not even invites, pushes, thrusts just about every leader in both testaments into the actual wilderness at a pivotal time in history and at a pivotal time of their own leadership development. The more I read, I was like, wait a minute, they went into wilderness? They went into wilderness? These people were sent into actual wilderness and actual soil, actual trees, actual deer. Why? What is that? What if the wilderness was a place to listen to the divine voice, a place to listen to the voice of burning bushes, and to remember that they belong to a bigger story, to remember their identity? God understood that the only way to really heal from that kind of trauma is to be deeply immersed in the natural world.
We've been talking with Victoria Loorz, author of the new book called Church of the Wild: How Nature Invites Us into the Sacred. In our conversation so far, she has shared from her own experiences some of the ways we can practice a more earth-aware spirituality. If you find yourself wanting to explore more ideas for greening your faith practices, you might want to check out a new Circlewood blog called The Ecological Disciple. This is a resource for those who want to pursue an integrated faith that sees the connections between soil care and soul care, renewable energy and racial justice, child poverty and climate change. It's a blog for those who want to help bring renewal to people and planet. Be sure to check it out at www.ecodisciple.com. That's ecodisciple, all one word, .com. And of course, we'll put that link in this episode's show notes as well. And as always, you can find the show notes on the Earth Keepers podcast website. And now let's return to our conversation with Victoria Loorz. The movement that has grown out of these ideas, I mean, practically speaking, how do you gather church around such revelation? How do you gather a community of people in such a way that people are supported in their seeking a new way to perceive the world? I mean, what does that church look like?
After that 7 years of leaving church, I went back and I was an associate pastor at a church in Southern California. And just about every sermon over those 2 years was exploring these different questions. And finally, when I was leaving, my very last day, a group of people gathered around me and said, that church that you've been talking about that meets outside, do that. And so we got together. Our first time, I remember it was the beginning of Advent. We met in a circle under an oak tree in our town. And I invited people. We had some readings and some prayers. And then I invited people to wander on their own for 20 minutes and to allow themselves to be drawn to some place, some beings, a tree or the river. Just settle down there and listen. Everybody came back going, oh my gosh, we need more time. And so the wild church gatherings that I did after that were at least 45 minutes to an hour of that solo time. And then we would come back together in the circle and share our experiences. And there's something in being witnessed and expressing and speaking this profound numinous experience, even if it was, I sat by the river and the river was cool and I felt relaxed. But some people had very profound experiences of seeing something mirrored back to them about their own life and seeing something about this other being that they'd never noticed before that would begin this kind of like actual connection and feeling the presence of, the actual, and instead of talking about God, it's like experiencing God directly is really what I think the core of the practice is.
So currently there are lots and lots of different expressions of wild church, and people I think are still
Mm-hmm.
experimenting into new forms. They're trying to figure out, what do we do with this idea together? What do we do with this new practice, this new view of the world? But I think importantly, in your book, your case is not join a wild church or find a wild church, but rather cultivate wild spirituality, which means that everyone can participate in this thing that you're inviting them into. But how would you describe wild spirituality? What does that look like, and what does it mean to cultivate it?
First of all, I sort of use the word wild because not all people live near a place where they can go to a river and cross a creek and be under an oak tree. But I use the word wild to mean, what is natural, we might want to say, what is God made, what is undomesticated and untamed. And it's sort of like the essence of who you are and the essence of what this tree is and the essence of what the world is. And so it's really cultivating that wildness within ourselves, encountering the wildness within, our own yard. And it's really, I think, developing a sacred relationship with the rest of the world where we belong. We've sort of been so disconnected for so long, we forget that we belong to nature, that nature isn't separate from us. But now I feel even caring for creation has a bit of that hierarchy built into it. Like, we are the ones here to care for creation. And now it's more moving from stewardship into relationship and remembering that we actually belong in this interconnected web. And like our indigenous brothers and sisters get it, they call all the others, just as St. Francis did, kin, brother and sister. And for us as the Western church and the Western civilization, that just feels really foundational. So that's the foundation of wild spirituality, is remembering that we belong to a bigger, a larger story. Remember that we belong to a larger beloved community than people that look like us or even people. And so I just encourage people to approach reverently, approach the others in your yard. You may be the only human that ever sees this particular flower in your yard, or this particular little grasshopper, or and it sounds so simple and so not important, but it is. It's cultivating a practice of deep compassion and of connectedness. And so I think it's cultivating that is listening more deeply than our own voice. And you can feel that if you've ever spent time in nature, and especially if you spend time in nature alone. And after a little while, those little voices inside of your head stop being so loud. And then you can start to hear the others, and you can hear the birds, and you can hear what's happening in the forest. And then even then it goes even quieter. And then you can hear the voice of the sacred in all, and you can sense that interconnection.
I would think that for some people, it's also a matter of courage.
Absolutely.
I would guess that some people are listening to us today, listening to you talk. And if they haven't already turned off the podcast, they maybe want to, because there's something threatening about this idea, don't you think? I think especially if you've grown up in a culture that devalues that doesn't see that as important or relevant or even real, or even teaches you to be suspect, right? That if you think God is speaking in nature, well, then we're not maybe talking about Christianity, quote unquote. So I believe that to even begin to cultivate that, to open ourselves to that, does for some people take courage.
I think it takes courage for all of us, because even if you have enough courage to go out on your own to talk about it with other people, you'll be either dismissed as, oh, isn't that cute? Or like, you're a little bit nutty, that's a little woo-woo, or something like that. Mm-hmm. And we have a whole culture and a whole language that supports that disconnection from the natural world. So, and there's all kinds of even scientific words like, oh, you're anthropomorphizing that, that tree's not saying anything to you. You're projecting that onto the tree. And, that sounds reasonable. And yeah, you might be. And we are connected, that we are connected by a God that is so much bigger than what we can put into our boxes or fit within a building without windows. That's telling us that what's holy is what's in here, and therefore what's holy is not out there. I rarely had a preacher tell me that nature is not God directly, but it happened indirectly all the time. I think it's an act of resistance and an act of reformation, honestly, to reform something that was there in the beginning that we're bringing back just by honoring the reality that this whole gift of life is interconnected, and we have the privilege of being part of it. And so to treat it with reverence is an act of spiritual resistance and reformation.
One of our recent guests is a musician, Jeff Johnson, and he made a really interesting observation that when I asked him about his relationship to nature, he described being in a natural setting as living in a work of art. So as an artist, he saw art all around him, right? And attributed that, of course, to the creator. And I thought that was an interesting framework, and it was his way into this wild spirituality. I think there are lots of ways in, right? But for him, it was all about looking around him and understanding just the wild creativity that was present everywhere.
Ooh, I love that.
While for some people it would, take courage to really explore these ideas, I would guess that for other people, there's going to be a lot of receptivity to this idea. And I'm thinking specifically of what Josh Packard calls the nuns and the duns, right? The nuns would be a generation who just never have had that church upbringing. And maybe even if they were raised in the church, maybe they walked away. And my daughter's generation is really in the process of walking away from the church because there is not that sense of relevance, of realness, of applicability. But then the duns, I think there's a generation of people who have realized that after all the investing they've done in the church as conventionally defined, realize that it's no longer enough. That they are hungry, perhaps, for a deeper experience of God, of God's truth, and I would imagine that those two groups in particular would be very open to this. It's a very life-giving and renewing and hope-restoring perspective, wouldn't you say? I mean, has that been your experience, that people have reacted to this idea with some relief even?
My kids grew up as a pastor's kid, and I really made a decision early on because I knew I had friends who were pastors' kids that were really hurt by that. And so I made a decision that would not be my way. And so I never really pushed any of it on them. And they stopped going to church probably by middle school, definitely by high school. When I started Church of the Wild, both of them just came alive. And I remember the first time my daughter came, and she went and wandered and came back and shared this poem that she had written. And it was like, oh my gosh, I had no idea you had that deep of a relationship with God. Like the language of the church just so did not resonate with her that we had no language to even communicate. And all of a sudden, like this depth of relationality, and both of them stunning, knowing without knowing, they had this relationship with God, this spirituality that was very deep, that could be expressed in Church of the Wild. And a bunch of my daughter's friends stayed, high school kids stayed, and would go to Wild Church with us even after she went away to college. Almost every Wild Church that I know of that meets collectively, at least 40% of the people don't identify as Christian in any way. They're either nuns or duns. But people that are done or don't have any unlearning to do, just like oh, this is what I already naturally, how I do connect with the sacred.
What if people would be interested in finding others of like mind and like heart? Are there enough wild churches here and there that people, might visit them? I mean, I know there are other movements in the world as well. Like we have Wild Church here, but Forrest Church I've heard about and been trying to learn about actually in the UK. But I'm just wondering what your sense of that is. Is this something that you think will increase, and that more and more communities like this will gather around this different way of seeing?
A lot of people are like you're asking, can I just go visit one? And I don't think there's enough that one in every community kind of thing. But there is a map on the Wild Church Network website to find others who are interested or who are starting a wild church. And there's a whole bunch of other communities, like you said. There's Garden Church, and there's Agrarian Church in the Episcopal Church. There's Holy Hikes. There's food networks. There's all kinds of great iterations of this that are all doing kind of the same thing in different ways. And so I see new networks coming up all the time, both within the Christian tradition and in other traditions. People are starting to come to the Wild Church Network to say, how do I do this? Tell me how to do this. And we always say, we can't really answer that. This isn't so much of a how to as a permission to, that each geolocation, each bioregion has a particularity. And, your particular gifts, you are the person who called in here, that there's something, rumbling within you, some calling within you, that you have some particular gifts for this, that you don't need to be ordained by an institution to do this. And the particular people within your community, like it's going to have a different expression in your community than it is in a different one.
I always ask people in the podcast where they're finding their hope these days. It's harder and harder to find hope, especially when you think about the health of the planet and ecological degradation. But my question to you might be a bit more complicated, and I'm not sure even how to ask the question. But given that that's where we are with the discouraging news we hear about climate change and environmental destruction, do you think that has anything to do with the fact that this movement is rising up now, that people are rethinking what spirituality is, rethinking what church means? Do you think that the two are linked in any way?
I believe the Paschal mystery is embedded in all things, and that when there is new life, it's preceded by death. And they're just linked. It's like when a baby is born, the baby crowns into the new world the instant that the old world in the womb ends. It usually happens pretty much at the same time, and they're linked together. And so I absolutely think that these are works of spirit. Both, it's harder to say that the dying is part of it, but it is. Like the reality of life continuing is based on a system of predation, which is hard to wrap my heart around, much less my head. But there's a reality in that, and I think we find hope in love. That no matter what happens, we love this planet, we love the people, we love the creatures, and that's the part that gives us hope. It kind of takes you out of the, oh my gosh, that anxiety that I felt when I was in the climate movement of, we got to do this, we got to raise this money, we got to, if you don't recycle that, like the whole world's going to, it's like, if you do recycle it, we're going to save the planet, we're going to stop global warming. Like that anxiety, like keeps you in a place of like not breathing. And there's something about just when you enter into relationship, that's risky. Besides what other people think of you, it's risky because when you fall in love and you allow yourself to love, you're opening up to the pain and the trauma of the other. And so it opens you up to more grief. And so I think entering into that grief, that collective grief, is part of the work that we're doing. It's part of what this wild spirituality is to willingly feel the pain. When we're truly in love, we're going to do everything we can to protect and restore and make space for, out of love. You're not doing that because you have an illusion that this is going to save the world. We're doing this because we love this land. We love these trees. We love these people who are drawn together here. And so that love is what gives me hope. And I think that this movement is about allowing a new relationship with one another. It's a spiritual practice of new relationship with the natural world. There's a quote that I have in my book. It's with Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass. She's an indigenous botanist, biologist, scientist, and teacher. And she says, "It is not enough to weep for our lost landscapes." So the grief is good, but it's not enough to weep for our lost landscapes. We have to put our hands in the earth to make ourselves whole again, not just to make the land whole, but that practice of making the land whole makes us whole again too. Even a wounded world is feeding us. Even a wounded world holds us, giving us moments of wonder and joy. I choose joy over despair.
We've been in conversation with Victoria Loorz about her new book, Church of the Wild. For a list of the ideas presented in this podcast and for links to online resources, please check out our show notes on the Earthkeepers podcast website at www.circlewwood.online/Earthkeepers. If you're interested in being part of a drawing for a free copy of Victoria's book, go to the podcast website and use the voicemail function to leave us a message. Just tell us why you listen to the Earthkeepers podcast, and we'll enter you into the drawing. Finally, if you appreciate this podcast and want to help us expand its global reach, please show your support by subscribing. Just go to whatever platform you listen to podcasts on and hit the subscribe button or the follow button for the Earthkeepers podcast. Earthkeepers podcast explores ways in which we can change ourselves, our communities, and our cultures to help us to care for the earth in holistic and regenerative ways. Through curated conversations, we highlight the wisdom of thought leaders and change agents who are making a difference and showing us a way forward. When Earthkeepers stand together, they amplify the impact of their resistance against environmental injustice and multiply their efforts for renewal and restoration. I am Forrest, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Our producer is Dave Olfers. Forrest Reed is our editor and the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman, and Jesselyn Megerly is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening, and please join us next time on the Earthkeepers podcast.